And now, on behalf of the General Assembly, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Chad to introduce an address by the head of state.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished delegates, I have the honor to introduce His Excellency Mohamed Idriss Déby, President of the Transitional Military Council, President of the Republic of Chad, to present his statement. Thank you. Mr. President of the General Assembly, heads of state and delegations, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to extend my warm congratulations to His Excellency Abdallah Shahid on his brilliant election to the presidency of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and to wish him every success in his mission. Chad assures him of its support throughout his mandate. I would also like to extend our sincere gratitude and pay deserved tribute to His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, outgoing President of the General Assembly, for having successfully carried out his mandate despite the difficult context marked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, I would like to warmly congratulate His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, on his brilliant re-election on June 18th, and thank him for his leadership. Chad reiterates its support and high appreciation to the Secretary General for the excellent work during his previous mandate and his dynamism in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chad commends the quality and relevance of the important reforms that he has carried out in the pillars of peace and security, development system management, as well as the gender parity strategy within the United Nations system. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the theme of this session, namely building resilience through hope to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainably, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations, eloquently reflects the multiple challenges the world continues to face for the second year in a row as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has traumatized humanity by the magnitude of its multifaceted and multidimensional impacts across the planet. It continues to wreak havoc, straining our health systems, our economies, our public finances, and even the functioning and security of our states, to name but a few. With more than 4.5 million dead and 220 million persons infected, as well as completely devastated economies around the world, developing countries in general, and those in Africa in particular, have been deeply impacted due to their structural vulnerabilities. Given the persistence of the pandemic and its devastating consequences, mobilization is required in order to amplify the response to the pandemic and sustainably support recovery efforts for the post-COVID-19 period. In this regard, I note with regret that the inequality in access to vaccines remains great. Rich countries have achieved immunization coverage above 50%, while most African countries are below 2%. according to the World Health Organization, of the more than 5 billion doses administered worldwide, only 2% have gone to Africa. Nothing could justify this imbalance given the interdependence of our world and the need to eradicate the virus from the entire planet. In that context, it is incomprehensible, in fact, unacceptable, that some countries are stockpiling surplus vaccines while others are in dire need of them. The virus knows no continents nor borders, to say nothing of nationality or social status. Unvaccinated countries and regions will be a source of spread of the virus and the emergence of new variants. In this regard, we welcome the repeated calls by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of WHO to make the vaccine accessible to all. The salvation of all mankind depends on it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, improving the prospects for post-COVID-19 economic recovery is closely linked to improving the health situation or the eradication of the virus and end of the pandemic. This expected economic recovery is also dependent on reducing the divide in all areas between the North and the South. Developing countries severely affected by COVID-19 are already facing various recurring obstacles, such as debt burden, difficulty in accessing resources to finance their development, unfair terms of trade with the developed world, the scarcity of foreign direct investments, the reduction in remittances from the diaspora, the collapse of the tourism sector, and so on. In addition, the least developed countries and landlocked developing countries, including Chad, are also affected by the non-fulfillment of commitments made under the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Program of Action in the area of official development assistance. Chad once again launches an urgent appeal to all our partners in the North to honor their commitments to vulnerable countries with a view to contributing in a sustainable manner to a better post-COVID-19 economic recovery and accelerating progress towards the SDGs in accordance with the noble ambition of the United Nations to leave no one behind by the 2030 deadline. In that light, Chad reiterates the call repeatedly made by the member countries of the G5 Sahel relating to the cancellation of the debt of these countries, which have been hard hit by terrorism and climate change, in addition to COVID-19 and widespread poverty. It should be recalled that the absence of prospects for young people in the Sahel pushes them into the trap of extremist ideologies and prompts them to pursue illegal migration to Europe, with all the risks that this entails. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, following the tragic death of its president, the late Marshal Idriss Déby Itno, who fell on the field of honor on April 20th while combating mercenaries from Libya, Chad began a period of political transition. A transitional military council was set up to ensure the continuity of state functions and guarantee the security of the country, which is seriously threatened by heavily armed attackers plaguing the south of Libya. A broad-based government headed by a civilian prime minister was put in place on May 2nd, 2021, and it is working hard to meet the deadlines to complete the transition process. A roadmap for the transition was drawn up and adopted in July. It focuses around three main axes. One, strengthening security and defense. Two, organizing an inclusive dialogue and consolidating peace and national unity. And three, strengthening good governance and the rule of law. The implementation of this roadmap, the cost of which is estimated at nearly $1.3 billion, is beyond the reach of Chad alone and requires substantial support from our partners through an urgent mobilization of the necessary financial resources. In view of the enormous security, economic, financial, and health challenges facing the transitional government, Chad appeals to the international community for strong support. In the same vein, all the necessary arrangements have been made to hold an inclusive national dialogue, the modalities for the organization and conduct of which are currently being examined by a committee that has been set up for this purpose. In addition, for the sake of bringing all Chadians together, including armed groups, a special technical committee was established to facilitate the participation of political military forces in the inclusive national dialogue. In addition, following the broad and intensive consultations currently in progress, the National Transitional Council, which will assume the role of a provisional parliament, will be set up. The national reconciliation process is in any case well underway and is evolving at a pace that is appreciated both by national actors as well as by most of our partners. In this regard, it is my pleasure to note the return to the fold of several of our compatriots in exile and members of certain armed groups who are responding favorably to the policy of the outstretched hand of the government. I urge all of our brothers who are still outside their country to return without fear or hesitation. They will occupy their rightful place, and their invaluable contribution to the effort of national reconciliation and the building of our country is greatly desired and awaited. We will welcome them all with open arms. With this in mind, and aware of our duty before history and before the Chadian people, I would like to reassure this august assembly that nothing will undermine our commitment and our determination to conclude the current transition process. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad, which shares more than 1,000 kilometers of common borders with Libya and is linked to this brotherly neighboring country by the ties of history, geography, and culture, even by blood ties, is suffering the full brunt of the consequences of the Libyan crisis in terms of the recurrent armed attacks launched from the south of that country. The most recent attack against Chad between April 11th and 29th, and which caused the death of our former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno, was an unfortunate illustration of this, and not to mention the chronic insecurity and instability that has extended well beyond in the Sahel since 2012. It should be recalled in this regard that the UN Security Council, during its meeting held on April 29th at the request of its African members, established a direct link between the withdrawal of mercenaries and foreign fighters from Libya and the aforementioned tragic events in Chad. With this in mind, Chad expresses its deep concern at the strong pressure from the international community demanding an immediate departure of mercenaries, foreign fighters, and other irregular armed forces from Libya. Such a departure of Chadian nationals recruited, trained, supervised, armed, and financed for the needs of the war in Libya will not be without consequences for the security of Chad. That is why Chad once again urges the international community, and in particular the UN Security Council, to take all necessary measures for the establishment of a supervisory mechanism for a planned and coordinated departure of these elements. Chad is in favor of a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process for its nationals serving in Libyan factions who renounce violence and mercenary activity to return to their country. We are counting on the leadership and the crucial role of the United Nations in leading this process and mobilizing the resources necessary to finance it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot talk about the Libyan crisis without addressing the gravity of the security situation in the Sahel and its environs. It is marked by the spread of terrorism, organized crime, and illicit trafficking in arms, drugs, and human beings. The increase in terrorist attacks against the armed forces of the G5 countries in the Lake Chad Basin countries, as well as the civilian populations in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, illustrate the resilience of terrorist groups and their capacity to do harm. These groups seriously threaten the very existence of our states and jeopardize their development. The sacrifices made by the G5 Sahel Force and the Machinal Joint Task Force against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin have been enormous, but the danger persists and terrorists continue to wreak havoc, plunging innocent civilian populations into desolation and despair. In the face of this threat, which transcends borders and puts a serious strain on our individual capacities to react, we must review our response approaches and pool our efforts to better adapt responses to the changing context and challenges on the ground. The G5 Sahel countries are tackling this by mobilizing their meager military material and financial resources. Likewise, the response to the terrorist threat should integrate dimensions related to economic development, climate change, youth education, and access to basic social services by our populations. From this perspective, our countries affected by the scourge of terrorism, which is considered a threat to peace and security, have the right to count on the solidarity of the international community in a spirit of complementarity. We have no choice but to act together in the face of global challenges. Chad also underscores the imperative need for greater multifaceted support, both to the aforementioned joint forces and to their individual member states. To this end, Chad once again reiterates the appeal repeatedly launched by the Conference of the Heads of State of the G5 Sahel to the UN Security Council to grant the G5 Sahel Joint Force a mandate under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter in order to ensure its sustainable and funding. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad reaffirms its position of principle regarding the reform of the United Nations, in particular its Security Council. This reform, which has been called for by Africa for a number of years, simply reflects the legitimate aspiration of more than 1,200,000,000 Africans. How can we ignore this persistent call from an entire continent that has been unjustly excluded from a body which claims to be representative of all humanity and justice and equity of all nations, which are dear founding values of the United Nations? And Chad reiterates its commitment to the African Common Position as expressed in the Eswatini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to express to His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, to his organization and to all its member states, as well as to the regional organizations present in this room, our sincere gratitude and our deep recognition for the solidarity and moral support shown towards Chad following the tragic and sudden passing of the former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno. And finally, in the name of the founding principles of the United Nations and in that of friendship between the peoples, Chad reiterates its call to lift the embargo unjustly imposed on Cuba, which is seriously harming this country. With that, I wish us every success in our work, and I thank you for your kind attention.
En nombre
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank the President of the Transitional Military Council and President of the Republic of Chad for the statement delivered.